Hello again, I'm Dan Alasso for Lifelong Learners, and once again today I am coming to you with a chapter from my revised and partly new handbook, which I am going to call How to Read, Research, Make Notes, and Write. And this is chapter 2, which is called How to Read. And it begins with a couple of epigrams. The first of those is, "He who understands also loves, notices, sees. The more knowledge is inherent in a thing, the greater the love." And this is from Paracelsus, who was an early scientist and alchemist who lived from 1493 to 1541. And the second one is more recent. It goes like this. "Now, a few words on looking for things. When you go looking for something specific, your chances of finding it are very bad, because of all the things in the world, you're only looking for one of them. When you go looking for anything at all, your chances of finding it are very good, because of all the things in the world, you're sure to find some of them." And this is from a movie called The Zero Effect that was made in 1998. So I begin. Based on the title of this chapter, you might think at first that this section might be a little bit too basic. However, I would suggest that you give me the benefit of the doubt. There are several things that I think it's important to understand if we're going to read effectively and add to our understanding of issues that we're studying and the world in general. Many of these things have to do with some of the assumptions that we make about what reading is and how to do it. But we should also always think about why we do it. One of the best and most popular books ever published, in America at least, about this topic was Mortimer Adler's How to Read a Book, which he published in 1940, and then he reissued in a slightly expanded form with Charles Van Doren in 1972. And I think they say some very insightful things about the process. So I'm going to quote some of their thoughts here, as well as adapting them and expanding on their ideas to try to give you a better sense of what we're doing when we read and how to do it more effectively and efficiently. Later in this book, once we're familiar with all the steps in the process, I'm actually going to circle back around and give you a glimpse of how I processed their thoughts to come up with this section of the book. To begin with the most basic but important point, everything we do when we read has to be related to our goals. That includes how much effort we put into reading and what techniques we use. Are we trying to relax, amuse ourselves, and maybe tire our eyes a little bit before bedtime? Are we trying to appreciate a great work of literature and understand its contribution to the culture in which it was created and its relevance to ours now? Are we trying to learn new facts? Are we trying to understand an interpretation of the world and decide whether we agree or disagree with it? Are we going on to act on the information and the ideas that we find in what we read? And if so, how high are the stakes? And then finally, are we going to write? As I sit here at my desk in the fall of 2025, I'm very aware that a lot of people have expressed the opinion that we may be about to enter a post-literate culture, if we are not there already, where reading will not really be as central as it once was. Now, some people are excited by this prospect, while others are appalled and very worried. On one hand, there are many new media in addition to printed books that can provide some of the things that we look to books to find. And what I'm doing right now, of course, is an example of that. On the other hand, videos and audios and many podcasts are usually produced with the help of scripts. I'm reading from one now. And even when people are recorded talking casually and extemporaneously without the help of notes, like in a podcast, the information that they're relating often comes from written sources. Yes, your AI of choice can probably nowadays understand spoken questions and can probably answer you in speech. But at least for the foreseeable future, I think it remains necessary to double check to ensure that the AI isn't hallucinating and regurgitating an answer that's based on a flawed or an incomplete data set that it's drawn from. The first step in reading is simply, of course, understanding what we actually see on the page. And although this can be complicated, if what we're reading includes specialized vocabulary or ideas we haven't encountered before, or is in a foreign language or an archaic dialect, and as a historian I run into this a lot, the process is still pretty basic. And so I am going to assume some things about your abilities along these lines. But from this starting point, the process gets more complex and I think more interesting. So let's begin with inspection. Again, how complex the next steps get depends on our goals. Have I come to a book to understand the author's perspective and decide whether I accept or reject whatever thesis is being argued? Or am I just looking for data, for which I might have a different use? Adler and Van Doren, in their book, described this first serious stage of active reading as inspectional. Very often, my reading of a book or an article is entirely an inspection. I just want to know what the author's point is, what sources they used, how the argument is organized, who the author is agreeing or disagreeing with, and why it matters. In my profession, history, these are some of the main questions that inform a historiography, which is often about an idea or a set of ideas, rather than a particular author's sources, examples, and narratives. But I also often find the particulars of a book very valuable. The names and places and events can be extremely interesting in their own right and can suggest new lines of research for me. I often find both details and sources in texts that I inspect that I might pursue for entirely different purposes than the author had used them. And this is one of the most valuable aspects of having a note-making system that allows for robust linking, as we'll see soon. Some of the important first steps while I'm inspecting a book are to skim its preface, its table of contents, and its index, if these elements are present in the book. In an article or an essay, I look at the introductory and concluding paragraphs to get a sense of what the author claims, what they hope to achieve, and whether they think they did. And also at the citations to see if they made a serious effort. And one of the things that a quick inspection does before you devote hours or days that it might take to really read a book cover to cover is help you to decide if what you are going to get out of the book will be worth the effort. Even Adler, who was one of those people behind the great books movement of the 1950s, admitted that a book should be read as quickly or as slowly as it deserves, based largely on the reader's interests. Next, analysis. We may just be reading for specific data, which we can make note of when we find it and then move on. However, if we've decided that a book is relevant enough to our interest that we want to understand it more fully, then a series of questions naturally suggest themselves. What is the book about as a whole? What claims or arguments is the author proposing? How are those claims supported? I think it's fair to say that all good authors have a truth that they're trying to communicate. It's up to us as readers to understand what type of truth that is, how the author is trying to get their point across, and whether we think the author has succeeded or failed in that effort. It's also possible that we may encounter additional truths that may not have been the author's priorities. For example, reading Galileo today might tell us more about the man who pursued science despite persecution than about the particular things that he discovered. We also don't necessarily have to agree with the author's assessment of what was true or important about their writing. Of course, just imagine reading Mein Kampf. In addition, though, there can be big differences in what people get out of books, largely based on what they were looking for when they entered them. This is the same sort of thing as your highlights in a book being different from the person sitting next to you reading the same book. But that doesn't mean that anyone can get anything out of a book. Like people entering a castle on a treasure hunt. We can all look for and find different things, but we can only find what is actually there. And now, coming to terms. Adler and Van Doren also introduced an important idea when they said that one of the main things that we're doing when we engage with a book is creating a shared vocabulary and defining terms so that we're all saying more or less the same thing when we use them. They suggest that nearly all of an author's meaning is carried in the terms, which they define this way. They say, the relatively small set of words that express the author's main ideas, his leading concepts, constitutes his special vocabulary. They are the words that carry his analysis, his argument. It's our job to understand what these terms mean and what they don't, especially when the author is using a word in a way that other people don't. Terms like democracy or capitalism or goodness can mean different things to different people. And it's as much the author's responsibility to be specific as it is the reader's to recognize these keywords. If people don't define their terms, they're either sloppy or they're trying to pull something over on you. We want to be as sure as we can that we understand what an author is actually saying before we decide whether we agree or dissent. I'm going to assume from here on that we really are interested in honest discussion, rather than simply in scoring rhetorical points. Adler and Van Doren mentioned that one of the most familiar tricks of the orator or propagandist is to leave certain things unsaid, things that are highly relevant to the argument, but that might be challenged if they were made explicit. As readers, we need to be on the lookout for these types of omissions. And we also need to avoid making them ourselves when we write. But once we're sure that we understand the author's point, then we can begin critiquing it or making it our own, and then making our own points. How do we know that we've understood? Generally, if I can summarize the author's point, or whatever subset of it I was actually interested in a brief statement in my own words, then I can be relatively confident that I got it. Adler and Van Doren build on this foundation to introduce a technique of comparative reading that they call syntopical, which I'll return to later. In the meantime, I think this gives us enough of a foundation to dig more deeply into highlighting and to begin thinking of making notes. Writing is thinking. I've already said this, but I'll repeat it again because I think it's more than just a catchy phrase. In a very real way, writing is thinking. This is a key point, and it's backed up by science. Neuroscientists have found we can only keep about 7 thoughts in our attention or our short-term memory. Worse, they also say that the window of consciousness during which we can focus on a particular thought is only about 7 seconds. The exception to this limit, historically, has been when we are talking to somebody else. In prehistory, before writing, talking was thinking. Today, writing has taken the place of talking. Some people see this as a loss, but it may be a bit safer. Things that are said can still be forgotten. And while it may be possible to talk without thinking, it's probably a little bit more difficult to write without thinking. Writing an idea down in a way that makes sense is how we determine that we have really understood a topic or a point. It's also the first step in making the idea our own. I mentioned before that a big part of learning involves taking possession of ideas. Although we will continue to give the originators of information and of interpretations that we use credit with appropriate citations, just as they did before us with their sources. When we can express an idea in our own words, it's on the way to becoming ours. You've probably often heard that a good way to test your knowledge of something is to teach it to somebody else. This is the same concept, but a little earlier in the process. There are several stages of this process, and as you move through them, the ideas you're working with will become progressively more your own, because you'll be progressing from recording data to interpreting the information and making insights that are relevant to your own interests or project. Generally, the steps in the process of making other people's information into our own knowledge are: first, we highlight a text, take notes on a lecture or a video or a podcast or other source, or we just jot down ideas as they come to us. Second, we summarize and paraphrase, and only very rarely quote this information into what I am going to call a source note. And then third, we engage with the idea and comment or elaborate on it in what I call a point note. Now, I've capitalized the names of these two types of notes in the text because there's been a lot of energy devoted over the years to naming different types of notes and the workflows that they represent. As I mentioned before, the sociologist Niklas Luhmann developed a technique called Zettelkasten, which is a German word that literally means note chest. He wrote a couple of articles about this process and said in one of them, "It is impossible to think without writing." He seemed to realize that this claim might be considered a bit of a reach, so he immediately qualified the statement and continued, "At least it is impossible in any sophisticated or anschlussfähig fashion." This German word can be translated as connectable, but many readers today prefer to say networked. Several other scholars have written more about this since his death in 1998. One of these, an educational researcher named Sönke Ahrens, wrote a bestseller in 2017 called How to Take Smart Notes. That was its title in English, but he called it Das Zettelkastenprinzip in German. So as you would expect from this German title, the book was Ahrens's attempt to translate Luhmann's technique into non-academic language and also to make it compatible with a range of new digital applications. An entire genre of personal knowledge management has blossomed on YouTube and Reddit, in blogs, and even in online courses. This is what its fans call PKM. In addition to Zettel, some of the other names used for various types of notes are fleeting note, literature note, reading note, permanent note, evergreen note, main note, and atomic note. Apps such as Zotero, Rome Research, Notion, Evernote, Obsidian, The Brain, MyMind, OneNote, SimpleNote, Bear, Notability, MarginNote, and many others have jumped on that network statement that Luhmann made, and many claim to be the best way to make and to organize your notes. Some critics of excessive automation argue that too much technology may actually get in the way of understanding and insight. I suspect that the best tool set varies based on the specific job that you're trying to do and your own preferences and tech skills. I'm going to try to focus on the workflow and avoid taking sides too much. So what are highlights? Far more important than what these notes and techniques are called is what they do to help you make that transition from acquiring information from others to making it your own. The most basic of these, and the first, is a simple highlight of what jumped out at you from a text. This is the first stage of filtering. Maybe the to be or not to be speech in Hamlet didn't really spark your interest that much, but the prince's treatment of the two courtiers, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, left you with thoughts and questions. Although these two minor characters only get a combined total of about 125 lines in Hamlet, the modern playwright Tom Stoppard was interested enough in them that he wrote a funny, absurdist one-act play featuring them in 1966 called Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. Now, as an aside, I didn't know how many lines the courtiers had in Hamlet. So rather than go to my shelf and grab my Shakespeare anthology and try to count the lines throughout the play, I asked AI. It may be wrong or it may be right, but since it was a tangent and it wasn't my main point, I only worked on fact-checking it for a few minutes. But I think it was pretty close to right. We'll get back to AI's strengths and weaknesses in a bit. In the second stage, after highlighting, which I call the source note, you'll summarize and paraphrase the passage that grabbed your attention. Occasionally, you might quote a line or two, if they seem to especially capture the thought, or if you think you might use the quote in output. But the idea is not to fill a notebook or a card file with inspirational quotes. It's to begin the transition to your own words, which is the transition to your own thoughts. In the third stage, you'll return to the source note, or sometimes even to a whole stack of notes, and you'll begin to analyze it, describing your reaction to the source material and how it relates to the problem that you're working on or a question that you're addressing. As you write this new note, which I call a point note, the focus shifts from the source material to your own thoughts. This is where you begin taking real ownership of the idea, using the source as support for a thought that you're pursuing or a point that you want to make. Although it will vary widely depending on the type of content that you're working with, the ratio of these things will probably contract sharply like a funnel as you move from highlights to source notes to point notes and make the ideas your own. In some cases, the reduction could be in orders of magnitude. For example, you might distill 100 highlights into 10 source notes that you want to preserve, and those into just 1 or 2 point notes. This is a pretty good result. If after highlighting 100 items in the text that caught your attention, you manage to achieve an important insight. And obviously, the more highlights and source notes you make, the more insights you can expect. Within reason, of course. You can't highlight every line in a book and expect to be able to narrow down onto insights. The way you make highlights will vary depending on whether you own the book or not and whether it's digital or analog. If you're reading a textbook that you need to return in good shape, or if you're reading a library book, then you can use little sticky notes to mark the pages. There are many types of these. They're cheap and reusable, and the good ones have triangular arrows on one end that let you point very specifically at what you're interested in. On the other hand, if you own the book, then colored highlighters or pencils or pens all have their advantages. Sometimes you only want to highlight, but sometimes you may also want to comment, or at least to remind yourself of what train of thought the highlight reminded you of when you read it. Finally, if the text is digital, there are usually highlighting and commenting capabilities in the readers. Some can be exported to aggregator apps that can sweep the highlights into a digital note-making system. I personally use Readwise to let me review my Kindle highlights and also to send them to my Notes app, Obsidian. For web pages, HTML, and PDFs, I use the annotation app Hypothesis to make highlights and comments while I read, and then Readwise will also send those into Obsidian for me. But I also have stacks of 3x5 cards and lots of sticky notes. So if the first step in creating this new knowledge for ourselves and then reporting it out to the world in our own writing or speaking or blogging or video making or whatever is finding sources and learning from texts, then the very first question of all might be, so what is a text? For our purposes, a text can be any statement that you run into in written or visual or spoken form. One of the two epigrams at the beginning of this chapter came from a centuries-old book. The other was a quote from a recent movie. And many scholars in specialized fields also consider images, artworks, or music to be texts that they can analyze. At the very least, in the context of a class, anything that you read in a textbook, an assigned reading, a primary source, or that you hear in a lecture is a text. You can take notes on what the instructor says and review those notes later. Even a discussion can be a source of valuable notes, especially if people have prepared their observations and their arguments well. Out in the world, news, articles, podcasts, and conversations can all be sources of new information or interpretations. All the material that you're putting into the mill and grinding up and analyzing and rearranging and thinking about and turning into new knowledge counts. In today's world, we can reasonably expect that the need to continue learning is probably going to be lifelong. So we should be constantly looking for new information to expand our understanding, thinking about texts and analyzing them all the time. An important element of this is critical thinking, which is Try not to just passively accept what you're told or what you read. Ask questions. Look for evidence that might corroborate or challenge claims. And compare what you're reading and hearing with things that you've read or heard before, and also with things that you believe. And write your thoughts down, because again, writing is thinking. And to be effective over time, your thinking should be written down. We've probably all experienced an aha moment when, out of the blue, things that we've been pondering suddenly seem to fit together and make sense. But how often have we lost that insight because we failed to write it down and then we forgot it? Also, trust me on this, these aha moments become more frequent and more rewarding when you're writing your thoughts down. Writing notes is really pretty easy once you get the hang of it. And it's a way of proving to yourself, and eventually proving to others, that you've understood a text or an idea. Our notes can also provide us some clues into what parts of a text actually did interest us, as they did for Luhmann. Where a source's ideas really excite us, you'll see notes cluster. Even so, we should try to write a separate note for each discrete idea. Not necessarily for each and every highlight, but for the main idea that you take from one or a number of highlights. And this will help you to retrieve the idea when you need it. It's better than nothing, but it's not really all that helpful to have to scan through a 3,000-word review of a book you've just read just to find a particular point. And I say this from experience. Getting in the habit of recording one idea per note makes the ideas easier to find, and it also trains us to write succinctly in plain language. Single note ideas are also easier to mix and match with other ideas that they agree with, disagree with, or modify in interesting ways. And this is useful because by the time an idea has made it from a highlight to a source note and then to a point note, it has already been well filtered by our interests, and it's ready to be compared with other ideas. Some of the questions that you can use when turning highlights into source notes and then into point notes are, how is this new idea relevant to the question that I'm considering? Is this idea similar to or different from the others to which I'm comparing it? And in what ways? Does it agree or disagree? And then finally, are there other connections that may not have been mentioned in the source? One of the big advantages of having notes is that often you'll find connections that other people didn't. And that's where the fun begins. Now, the expression comparing notes is a metaphor for talking through ideas for a good reason. And it is often easier to compare ideas when we're looking at them on a page, rather than just trying to work them out in our heads. Also, reviewing written notes helps us to avoid several mental biases that can get in the way of understanding. A bias, for example, called the mere exposure effect, suggests that we often mistake familiarity for expertise. We also tend to prefer information that we've seen more recently to information that we learned a long time ago. Finally, because we're usually seeking confirmation, we often overlook inconsistencies and contradictions. Written notes can help to illuminate these inconsistencies, as well as putting both old and new ideas on equal footing. They can also remind us that we have changed over time by providing a written reminder of what we thought in the past. And this is especially useful in light of recent studies, many of them made on PTSD sufferers between 2000 and 2015, although the neuroscientists that did the studies believe that their conclusions apply to non-traumatic memories as well. These studies suggest there's a process called reconsolidation, in which a memory becomes malleable, soft, while we're recalling it. And that allows for updates, or strengthening, or weakening, or change. If we're constantly changing our memories as we're working with them, it's especially valuable to keep records. Sometimes the notes that we make from our highlights seem to live in an in-between world where they're partly data and partly interpretation. This is okay. With practice, your source notes will become more like data and your point notes will become more analytical. Sometimes this requires revisiting a note several times. I'm not a big fan of what's called spaced repetition because I'm not typically trying to keep an idea in my memory alone. But I do think that reviewing notes is important and should be a regular practice. Source notes, and especially point notes, should be written in a way that will allow you to understand them out of context without having to reacquaint yourself with the entire train of thought that they're contained in. The goal is for another reader to understand them, especially when that other reader is your future self, who will probably have forgotten a lot of the context in which the original highlight or note was embedded. Finally, most note-making systems insist that new notes should be connected with an existing note when you add them into your train of thought. Some people have entire elaborate numbering systems or keywords that work really well for them. I'm a bit agnostic on this issue, and I'll cover it in more detail in a bit. The point for now is that linking a new thought to an existing train of thought may be a key to your note-making system working well for you. Where does this new note fit into your thoughts on an issue, your questions about a topic, your ideas about a puzzle that you're working on solving or a problem you're struggling to understand? Disciplining yourself to make this connection when you're first making a note can be a bit tough and time-consuming at first, but it's probably worth the investment. Without understanding how these ideas that interest us fit together, all we might end up with is a pile of unrelated trivia. Once you've discovered a text that you're going to process for its ideas, analyzing the text is the same as analyzing any other machine. It's deconstruction. You take it apart so that you can see what it's supposed to do and how it does its job. The author, W.H. Auden, demystified both literature and criticism when he said, "Here is a verbal contraption. How does it work?" In the next chapter, we'll dig more deeply into the mechanics of making notes and working with ideas. But that's all for now. So I hope you found this a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you again soon.